Welcome to Red Church. We're a community following Jesus in his alternative way of life, seeking renewal in our hearts, our city, and our world. We pray this message encourages you, challenges you, and draws you closer to Christ. Let's jump in.
Jerry Schammel was an American sportscaster. And one morning he was waiting to get back home, and his flight had been cancelled 4 times. Finally, he was put on a flight United 292, and he began his journey home. Upon arriving at the airport, he did what most of us do after you arrive at an airport, which is to retrieve your checked-in luggage. Except this wasn't an ordinary flight. Jerry's flight had crashed. 112 people were killed. Jerry found himself almost hanging upside down, flames all around him. And having exited the plane, he did something which was really his body in shock, going into automatic pilot, which was to retrieve his checked luggage. This shows us that at moments of great shock, at moments where what you're expecting doesn't not just happen, but something radical happens, our brain goes into this strange pattern where it just goes to what it knows. In many ways, that's the background happening to what I'm about to read. We have the story of the disciples who have been following Jesus for 3 years. This community gathered around him. At times, it was fame and celebrity. The crowds dropped off as Jesus preached more about the reality of the kingdom. But there was this core who followed him. As they got to the cross seemed to contradict everything that they expected. In Jewish understanding of what to be cursed was, in the book of Deuteronomy, it said, if you are hung by a tree, you were cursed. You were unclean. And the cross was understood as a wooden tree, hence the reason it was used, in a sense, not just to kill people, but to curse them. And so to see this Messiah who, in their expectations that they'd wrapped around him, something that we explored on Good Friday, killed in this way was unimaginable. This is not how it was meant to turn out. It's funny, when I was a boy, Jesus seemed so much older than me. And in my 20s, he was still older than me. And then you get to the beginning of your 30s, and you're like 30, and you have your 30th birthday. Like, wow, I'm not in my 20s anymore. And then I remember realizing, like, hang on, this is the age that Jesus was when he began his ministry. And then you get past that age. And so he was this young man, spoken with authority, spiritual power. Saw people in ways they'd never been seen before. Just this incredible figure who they put everything on the line to follow. And then he dies. The men hide. They know that they've nailed their colours to the mast, that they're followers of Jesus. And all of a sudden now, Jesus has been executed by the authorities, and they fear reprisals, and they go into hiding. The ones who are there burying Jesus, and we looked at this on Good Friday, are the ones who, the faithful few, Mary, Joanna, Joseph of Arimathea. And their actions are in shock, but they flip into what they know. Like Jerry Schammel getting a bag after he landed at an airport, they just go into rote. They prepare his body, they wrap it in this linen tightly. Talked on Friday about, you can imagine this face they knew so well, these hands they knew so well, being wrapped and disappearing beneath the linen, disappearing Messiah. Thought he was the Messiah. It's not how Messiahs were meant to go out. And so we pick it up in Luke 24, verses 1 to 12. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, Sabbath has just broken. It's quiet. Perhaps the birds are the only noises. The women head to the grave, taking the spices they prepared, and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living amongst the dead? He's not here. He's risen. Remember how he told you while he was with you in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners to be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11, that's the disciples, and to the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. The strips of linen that Jesus' body was wrapped in represented honor, respect, remembrance. They were signs that kingly echoes. And we looked on Good Friday how they were a mirror to what Jesus was buried in. What was the plan of the women? What were they doing? What were they expecting? I think in some ways, obviously they weren't in a plane crash, but this was like a plane crash and they just went into rote. They'd always ministered to Jesus and they continued to do that. But were they doing this because they expected his imminent resurrection? I don't think so. Why turn up to a tomb with burial spices? Why spend so much money honoring someone? If you were burying someone you loved and you knew that they were going to be raised, I'd be like, what is the cheapest coffin actually, let's just go to Bunnings and make something out of plywood, because if you're getting out of there, I'm not spending any money on that thing. Luke also tells us that the women had forgotten Jesus' words that he would be resurrected. There'd been hints. Lazarus, the widow who Jesus encounters them carrying her son, and Jesus raises him from the dead. Jesus' words that he must die and on the third day be raised. And what we see here in the face of this moment of an empty tomb, memorialization falters. As cultures, we love memorializing people, great people we make statues out of. In Australia, there's the Anzac tradition where all over Australia, you go to any country town, there'll be somewhere a memorial to the soldiers' loss. You go to even Commonwealth countries, you see this everywhere. So memorialization can be beautiful. But here at the grave, it falters. This is not just about memory. The customs, the things you did at burial, tradition here fails. But when they encounter the angels, they don't just have repetition. They have a heavenly revelation. And it's then, almost like their spiritual minds just are then activated as they see, remember the words that Jesus had taught them. Then on the third day, he would be raised again. The women run to the men. The tomb's empty. He's risen. We've seen these angels. And you think the men would believe them, but they don't. And part of this, and I think this is part of it, we do know at the time that in a court of law, women's words were often not believed. But then again, as we looked at a few weeks ago, if you were here, Jesus is running a community here, which is very different. There's women have a place in this community, unlike any other place you could find in the ancient world. They are the funders, they're organizing. So yeah, these were Galilean fishermen. But I think this is just more than don't listen to the women. It says in the text that their words seemed to the disciples like nonsense. In Greek, the word is leiros. It means idle talk, tall tales. If you translate this from the Greek into the normal English, into the Australian English, it would be, come on, mate. Doesn't happen. Peter, though, responds. And what I love about Peter is Peter's physical. He grabs a sword. He's someone who clearly has worked with his hands. And so his response is physical. He runs. Now, this is not like, he's just got his active wear on, his shorts. No, this is a man probably wearing robes, hiking them up in sandals, running to the tomb through dust, through narrow Jerusalem streets. And when he gets there, the tomb cut into a hill. You can imagine his sort of big Galilean hand put on the stone, bending into this darkness, his eyes trying to see into the dark. And all he can see is strips of linen. Tradition, repetition, rote is now laying on the ground. Custom cannot capture what is happening. There is a great hunger at the moment in our world for custom and order and tradition. I read an article, and there was then like 100 other articles written about this last week. And the headline of the article, this is in the New York Times, basically was New York's hottest club for young adults is now a church. And it talked about St. Joseph's Church in Greenwich Village, where there are now lines around the block of young people turning up to quite a high church in terms of tradition and so on. And this is fascinating. And I read more, and around not just Greenwich Village, not just that church, but other churches, similar things are happening. Around Australia this year, this Easter, record numbers of baptisms, confirmations in different churches. There is something happening in our culture where people are looking to the church. The sight of St. Joseph's being in Greenwich Village is really fascinating. Greenwich Village, if you've never been there, is really the bohemian heart of New York. It's where so many artists have come from, writers, jazz musicians. There was a famous newspaper, which is like one of the alternative presses in America, called The Village Voice. And actually, so much of how we think about the world, you can trace it all the way back to, it's almost the original hipster enclave of Greenwich Village. A famous sociologist, Warren Sussman, wrote a book, and in the book, he tried to ask the question, the way that we think about our lives today, how we sort of try and trust our instinct, we're skeptical about things, the modern person and how they just view the world. And he said that you could almost trace it back to the first original exploration of that happened in the cafes and the nightclubs of Greenwich Village. Jazz is about playing but not following the rules. The bohemian lifestyle is about breaking convention. And if you told the original bohemians of Greenwich Village that in a century, the coolest thing in their neighborhood, according to the press, is a high church called St. Joseph's, they probably wouldn't believe you. But something's happening in our world where, because as we go from crisis and chaos, a crisis ends and then a new one seems to appear on the horizon, is that people increasingly, because of the large-scale chaos and the individual chaos, they look for order. They look for tradition. They look for something that seems to have lasted the test of time. It's interesting, there's a book that was written in the mid-20th century, and I don't agree with a lot of it, but effectively it tells the story of the decline of the Western world. It's called, by Oswald Spengler, called The Decline of the West. And he makes this prediction half a century ago, 70 years ago, I think, that as the West began to fall into disrepair and chaos, he's like, it's going to happen at some stage. People will return to religion, but what they're not going to return to is the religion of the heart aflame, of an alive faith. They're not going to turn to a faith which looks forward into something dynamically happening now. They're going to look backward to what he called the second religiosity, second religion. And what they want is they want a religion of tradition, order, predictability, structure. He saw this as a danger. This was something you grab to as everything is falling around you. C.S. Lewis reportedly said that those who don't know God talk a lot about religion. And one of the trends that actually you're seeing increasingly in the culture overseas, it's starting to dribble down to Australia increasingly, is that there is this need for religion in the world, people to believe something, people to have a sense of community. And much of that is good stuff, don't get me wrong. But Lewis noted the people who know God don't talk about religion, they talk about God. They know there's something bigger than religion, something bigger than a return to order, something bigger than just a sense that church is useful because it gives you some people in an increasingly lonely world. And in many ways, the women speak to us here who go to the grave. They've got faithfulness. They remember what Jesus has done. They're trying to memorialize it. They're confused. But when they get to the grave, they don't encounter a tradition. They encounter angels. Not clothed in the linen strips of death, but clothes that gleam like lightning. And when you think about lightning, lightning is dynamic. It's sudden. It's multi-sensory. My two sons were just on wilderness camp in Mount Bogong. And one of my sons was part of one group, and they got top of the mountain. They'd finally made it, they hiked so many kilometers. And they got to the top as a lightning storm passed over the top of the mountain. And about 30 meters away, there was a lightning strike, this massive explosion. And my son said that their tour guide, he said he was like, my son described him, I think, as like a chilled, what do you call him, Trudy? A chilled out hippie or something. Said all of a sudden got really animated and was screaming at them, lay down, lay on your faces, screaming at them because of the potential and power of lightning. This is not just an honoring of something from the past with faithfulness. Faithfulness is beautiful, but this is something more. This was something active and new that God was doing now. The very foundations of the world were shaking spiritually, and the doors were being blown off of what the disciples would expect. Peter comes running into this, panting. The empty tomb. What was tradition now? Just refuse on the ground. This is not a looking back. We think of Lot's wife who turns to salt looking back. Jesus' words in Luke 9, verse 62, where he says, no one puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. And as the angels say to the woman, why do you look for the living amongst the dead? As humans, we can do this. Shaped by past regrets, past hurts, past beautiful seasons, our past heavy weight shaping who we are. Past and memory is still important. But what's happening in this story at this time is that resurrection is afoot. But what's important for us to remember is this is not just then, but now. What this says to us 2,000 years later is, don't look for Jesus in the tomb. Don't tend an empty grave. Little by little, there can be moments where our faith becomes something in the past. It can be an empty grave. We tend it, we're faithful, we're devoted, it's duty. But actually what this story tells us is that actually Jesus is doing something new, not just then, but now. If you're here, I want to encourage you, well, you are here. So are you here? You're here. I want to encourage us not to be a church of mere duty or faithfulness. Beautiful, needed things. But let's also be a church of resurrection power. In Luke 24, verse 49, Jesus says something really interesting. We talked on Good Friday, had constantly in Jesus' life, he was just clothed in our expectations, the kind of king that they wanted, not the kind of king he was. But it gets flipped after the resurrection. The resurrected Jesus says to the disciples in Luke 24, verse 49, I'm going to send you what my Father has promised. But stay in the city until you've been clothed with power on high. Angels with clothes gleaming like lightning. A church where people put on identities not defined by the past. A church clothed not just with stickability and tradition and order, but a church charged with resurrection power that comes from on high. You're going to hear in the next few months, with the state that the world is in, a lot about resilience, resources, national self-reliance, relationships, and the importance of them, all good things. But I just want to preach this morning that what this world needs is resurrection power. And every time we call for resurrection power, we realize we need it. We're like those women at the grave, encountering the angels, the disciples walking on the Emmaus road with a stranger. They don't realize until the bread is broken and the cup drunk from that it's the risen Jesus. The apostles in a closed room, Jesus walks through the walls. Their experiences, their agendas cannot account for what happened. It was something different that blows the expectations of culture out of the water. If you've been to Japan, like lots of people are traveling to Japan, have been in the last little while, and you've been to Tokyo, one of the places that often people will go is Shibuya Station. And at Shibuya Station, there is a statue of a dog. And it's a memorialization of a dog, and humans love the faithfulness of dogs. A dog who would always wait for his master to come on the train and then walk home with him. He would walk, knew the timetable, would wait and stand there or sit there, and then his master would come. When his master passed away, the dog would continue to sit. And so he's been honored with a statue. That's a beautiful story. It's a story of faithfulness and honoring and dependability. Again, all good things. But there's another story that's not memorialized in stone or statue at Shibuya Station, was that in 1948, a man named Mitsuo Fuchida was getting off the train. Thrust into his hand was a small tract or a pamphlet, handed to him by a missionary. Fuchida was a naval commander, famous in Japan for leading the front plane in the attack in 1941 in Pearl Harbor. There's a famous movie made of that attack, which brought Japan into the Second World War and the whole war in the Pacific. It's a famous movie that was made called Tora, 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 in Japanese, attack, attack, attack. It was Fuchida who said those words into the radio. Tora, Tora, Tora. But in the wake of the defeat of the war, he began to question the tradition that he'd given his entire life to. A tradition of unbending obedience to the emperor. Bushido, the way of the warrior. And in the tract was the story of a fellow warrior on the other side. A man named Jacob DeShazer, also an airman, also a pilot. And when America was attacked at Pearl Harbor, instantly he wanted to respond and undertook a daring mission led by a commander called Doolittle, and they flew all the way in these bombers, all the way to Tokyo and dropped bombs on Tokyo. It wasn't going to necessarily achieve anything, but it was a way of striking back. DeShazer was one of those pilots. He was shot down over China, captured, horribly tortured. And as he was tortured, the stories of the Gospels came back to him. The story of Jesus on the cross spoke to him. And in the prison camp, he became a believer. And after the war, the very people he had bombed, he felt the Lord saying to him to go back to his captors, not just his captors, but his torturers. And so DeShazer became a missionary to Japan. And Fuchida, reading this story, this completely blew any understanding of custom and how the world worked, and this honor and obedience and even revenge. The cycle of revenge which drove that war, drives all wars, still in our world today. Fuchida would go and buy a Bible. And in 1950, was baptized. He gave the rest of his life to sharing the gospel, and him and DeShazer would work together, meeting these two men who led these two attacks, bombing each other's countries, both experiencing tremendous suffering at the forces. But their story, driven by the belief in the resurrection of Jesus, who does unexpected new things, even in the midst of war. Jimmy Schemmel, 4 years after his plane crash, traveling on the road, finds himself still racked by grief. And in a hotel room, does something he'd not done since he was a child. He gained fame by being one of the few survivors of this aircraft crash. But his fame couldn't account for the loss he felt. And so in a hotel room, Jimmy Schemmel encounters Jesus. Shibuya Station, a man crashing a plane in Sioux Falls. But also stories in this room. People encountering a risen Jesus. Maybe that's not a story you've encountered yet, but this day reminds us that the living Jesus wants to meet you. Order, structure, tradition, faithfulness can be beautiful. But what this day reminds us, that this is a living, risen Jesus who wants to bring his power into your life. He wants to know you. For those who don't know you, so don't know him, he wants to meet you. The way he met Wichita. For those of you perhaps haven't been for a while, he wants to breathe new life into a faith that has perhaps become stale. For those who are like, yeah, I'm doing stuff and I'm following Jesus and I'm doing stuff, he wants to give you more. He wants to clothe us with greater resurrection power. So what I'd love to do is I'd love to pray now. I'm going to invite you to stand. And in a moment we'll worship, remembering the risen Jesus. But let's just spend a few moments in prayer. Jesus, we thank you that you went to the cross. We thank you that you showed a different way. We thank you that when Peter bent down and peered into the grave, that the tomb was empty and the linen were just scattered on the ground. And Jesus, just as we've brought symbolically linen here today, dead things, old things, customs which no longer serve you. Jesus, we want to encounter, as the disciples did, you as the risen Lord. We know you are present. We remember what happened 2,000 years ago, but we recognize, we know that you are here now. So we just pray that you will clothe us with your glory and your power. Meet every person in this room where you wish to meet them. And so, Jesus, we love you, we worship you, we honor you, we follow you. Let's worship.